Today's guest is John Kennedy Howard, a Hall of Fame cyclist and author of the book, The Black Cyclone, which chronicles Marshall Major Taylor's life, challenges, and extraordinary achievements. Marshall Major Taylor was a sports superstar. A cycling champion in late 1800s and early 1900s, he was once the highest paid athlete on the planet, and yet his name has largely been forgotten by history. This is a story about resilience, innovation, legacy, and the quiet power of being true to yourself, even if the world isn't ready. Okay, let's go. John, thank you so much for being here today. You wrote the book, The Black Cyclone, A Hero the World Forgot, about Marshall Major Taylor. Who was Marshall Major Taylor?
Oh, he was a fascinating man. He was really the first, I would call him the first acclaimed African American sports hero, not just in the United States, but worldwide. He had a huge following in Europe. He was celebrated in Australia, which were Europe, Australia, and America were the three hotbeds of bicycle racing. When the sport was actually bigger than baseball, it had maybe for all the wrong reasons, which I can elaborate on, but it had just a huge following. It was the NASCAR of the day. And when the fastest vehicle on the planet possibly would have been a express train or a racehorse, these cyclists traveling around a velodrome, or they actually call them bike tracks here and velodromes in Europe. But it was just tremendously exciting for spectators to watch this, and the competition was intense. There'd be sometimes a field of 50 or 60 riders on a rather small track. So it would mean that to win the race, you would have to be the most aggressive rider. And the advantage that Major Taylor had over a goodly number of the field was that he had that wonderful fast twitch muscle fiber, the white fiber, which made him just deadly fast. And he was not a big man. He was only about 5'6", maybe 5'7", and he had the ability to dart in and out of the pack, so he could maneuver his way through a field of, say, 40 or 50 riders in short order. But there were times when, due to the intense racism of the period, that a third of the field in a final event might not be riding to win, but to make sure Taylor didn't win.
Oh my gosh.
So that they at times resorted to all kinds of extremely dangerous techniques to bring him down. And on several occasions they were successful. Some of his worst crashes were at the hands of some of his fellow riders.
Mm.
And he was a very, I guess you could call him enigmatic. He had so many different the phases of his life. He wanted very badly to become the world champion, and he finally succeeded in doing that. And first he won the U.S. national championship, and then the world championship in Montreal in 1899, at which point he was a big draw in Europe. But he had some problems with the way racing, not so much in the US, but in Europe. The original contract that he tried to negotiate was for a huge amount of money, which today probably would have been close to $1 million.
Wow.
Just to race one season.
Wow.
And unfortunately, it didn't go down that way, because he promised his mother, almost literally on her deathbed, that he would never race on the Sabbath. He was a real strong Christian and believed that God was with him on his bike at all times. And that belief overshadowed a lot of things. And in Europe, I think it was kind of the norm to watch bicycle racing on Sundays because that was when it was presented. Europeans like their opera on Saturday and they like watching bike racing on Sunday. So he negotiated a much lower contract, but of course he got all of his prize money. At one point in his career, he was probably the highest paid athlete in the world.
Wow.
I think that's a foregone conclusion. But the contract he negotiated with Victor Briere, the French promoter, who basically handled him throughout all of his European tours, included a clause that said you can race only on Saturday, and that I think is hugely significant. Although none of the biographers have really gone into it in any depth, but that meant that the entire structure of racing in Europe had to change just to accommodate Major Taylor because he was such a draw. And he did not distinguish himself all that well in the early stages because it was a long boat ride to get to Europe in the day.
Right.
And it took him a while to get his legs. And he was soundly beaten by the great French rider, Jacquelin, who was a real plebeian favorite. They loved him because he was just downright crude. You know, when he beat Major Taylor, he thumbed his nose at him, which was the ultimate insult. And after Taylor got his himself back into perfect condition again, he started going to all of the countries in Europe, and the top riders would be and it was kind of a mano a mano event for them. They wanted to see match sprinting, which was two riders against each other. And while he did lose early matches, by the time the season was about half in, he distinguished himself by beating every single rider, including Jacquelin, and handed him the worst defeat he'd ever had in his career.
Wow.
So he came back and he used these little taunts that were so prolific in the U.S. racing, where he'd be insulted in some fashion. A good example: after every victory, they would play Dixie, which he hated. He
Yeah.
hated that. That's the battle hymn of the Confederacy.
Right.
And his father had fought with the North as a soldier and was wounded in the Civil War. His grandparents were slaves in Kentucky. So it goes way back. We want to trace it back to Africa,
Mm.
but Kentucky was a very strong slave state.
Yeah.
And that, I won't get into the politics of what happened after the Emancipation Proclamation, but the whole episode of Major Taylor's success, I think he drew a lot from his parents and his grandparents. And when push came to shove, he finally managed to come from a child prodigy background, from being, first of all, they laughed at him, to being the top rider in Indianapolis. And his coach, Bertie Munger, engineered some rather mischievous events where he basically just put him out there to race again. And then they didn't want to see Major Taylor in there. He was the fastest rider in the pack, and he would invariably win the races. So it was not a popular thing, and they eventually banned him from all the tracks. The Newbie Loop. There were several tracks. Some of them gave way to the Indianapolis Motor Speedway,
Wow.
and the promoters of bicycle racing became promoters of motor racing. But in his prime, Major Taylor distinguished himself by being the best U.S. rider, and in spite of all the odds against him, he rose to to the championship, won the nationals, and then eventually won the world championships in Montreal in 1899. So that's kind of a roundabout way of explaining some
Yeah.
of the nuances that he had to endure. But it was a fascinating, and please interrupt me at
Yeah.
any time, Megan,
Well,
because I'm
yeah.
going crazy on
What I
this.
love it. I'm like on the edge of my seat. So two questions. The first is what time frame are we talking about for his cycling career?
He was born the same year as my grandfather, 1878. His primary years were around the turn of the century. That was when he really hit his top form. But his first race in Indianapolis was almost by accident, and that would have been in 1893. So you can see he was young, 13,
Yeah.
14 years old. And he won his first race. I probably tell you a little bit about that. His employers at a bike shop. In the day, bike shops were plentiful especially in Indianapolis, and they had a section which is now the financial district in Indy called Bicycle Row. And there were 4 or 5 bike shops on Bicycle Row, and one of them was owned by this gentleman named Sam Hay, and he hired Major Taylor because Taylor was an acrobat. He could perform tricks on a bike and had a small low gear called a trick bike, single speed, and he used to use that to perform in front of the Hay Willits bike shop. And it was just people couldn't believe the tricks that he would do. I mean, he would ride the thing standing on the saddle and with his feet on the handlebars, steering it in circles, and did things that at the time at least were just nobody could believe that anybody could do such a thing.
How did
So,
he get introduced to the bike?
well, yeah, good question. Bicycles were a novelty, about the same price as an automobile today.
Wow.
And the way it broke out, his father was a coachman for a very wealthy family, the Southard family, and Mr. Southard was a railroad executive, which was a big deal in the day. And he hired a tutor for his own son, who was the same age as Major Taylor. And Major Taylor, whose actual name was Marshall at that point, didn't have the major yet, came to live at the Southern plantation. I guess you could call it. It
Mm.
was a huge mansion on North Meridian Street in Indianapolis, and he got the benefit of a tutored education, the first probably most of grade school. So he learned by a a tutor who was a really well educated man, and believed that it was important to do what was right for the child at the time, and whatever they were good at, since it was a small group of
Mhm.
boys there, they let them pick whatever they wanted. And in the case of Major Taylor, it was engineering. He was really interested in tool and die making and the science of engineering. The internal combustion motor just intrigued him to no end. So that was his focus on engineering, and it would pay out later because he invented some things that were really outstanding, like the outrigger stem, which allowed him to get into a more aerodynamic position on his bicycle. And he would sit back in the saddle. And if you look at riders of this era, many of whom were big guys, like 6'2", 6'3", 6'4", they all sat high on the bike. Well, yeah, they had more power than Taylor, but at the same time, Major Taylor understood what aerodynamics were all about. And because of that, he was able to tuck and get through holes that larger guys just couldn't get through.
Yeah.
And that helped him when he was doing time trialing. And time trialing was his favorite endeavor. And it was almost always paced by tandems, triplets, quads, and eventually motorcycles. and bicycles were evolving. It was a wonderful time after post-industrial revolution where bicycles, which had really been invented back in the 1860s, were coming full circle. They were going from the high wheeler to what they referred to as the safety. And the safety was wheels of the same size. And they would take these tandems. I have one, or I've got actually two of them in my museum here in Encinitas. They would take these bikes and they would hang a small, usually a Didion Berton French single cylinder motor in the rear triangle, and the back seat, or known as a stoker, would operate the motor, and the captain would steer the bike.
Hmm.
Those were the first motorcycles.
Interesting.
And they
Interesting.
were designed for the sole purpose of pacing racing cyclists on the track.
Wow.
And so they displaced overnight practically the human pace, which they just simply couldn't go fast enough, even
Sure.
with five riders. They just couldn't go fast enough. And now they were going 30, 40, even 50 miles an hour on a track that was never designed for such speeds, high banked. And it was not, well, I'll say there were several occasions where riders, pacers, and spectators died at the bicycle track.
Oh my
So
gosh.
it that's why I was saying it was really for all the wrong reasons.
Yeah.
People love the excitement of seeing those bikes crashing, and it was, they were
Yeah.
hungry for that kind of action, and it was the only place they could see it.
It really is like NASCAR. And so he was introduced to the bike through the Southern family, or
They bought him a. I'm
got
sorry,
it. No,
I
that's okay.
didn't. I went off on a tangent.
That's
But
okay.
yes, the Southerns bought him a bicycle, and it was a trick bike. It was the low gear bike that he could do tricks on, and that was the bike that he used in the first race, which was totally remarkable that he would actually be able to ride a bike. But he had that the fast twitch recruitment again, and out of that he was able to spin probably 150, 200 revolutions per minute. And the person that he beat in that race was Walter Marmon. And Walt Marmon was part of the Marmon family, and he was the Indiana state champion. His family went on to develop the Marmon automobile,
Hmm.
which was a prize of Indianapolis. And the very first winner of the Indianapolis 500 was the Marmon Wasp, driven by Ray Harone. And I just find this fascinating, the connections between the motor industry and the bicycle industry, because all of the riders, including Major Taylor, after the final, I guess after World War One, it was pretty much over. The automobile had displaced the bicycle, and at that point, bikes were just, they weren't labor saving anymore, and that's what everybody wanted at the time. And so what's happening is they're developing these bicycles into motorcycles, and eventually the tracks would get bigger, and they would be racing on their own. But all what I was trying to get at was
Hmm.
that there was nobody that was brave enough or stupid enough to drive these early motorcycles and automobiles. They were frightfully dangerous, and so many deaths occurred because of that. It was the bicycle racers who stepped in, and many of them. I'll give you an example. Oh gosh, Barney Oldfield, who we've a lot of us have heard of Barney Oldfield. He was Henry Ford's first test driver. He got too fat to race bicycles, bottom line, and jumped into the motor trade like so many of the other riders were doing at the time. But he was chosen by Henry Ford, handpicked,
Wow.
because Ford knew he was the best at the day, and the car, the 999, and it was steered by handlebars.
Oh my gosh.
So anyway, the connections go on and on and
Yeah.
on.
Yeah.
And Major Taylor was after he retired, he wanted so badly to get into motor racing, but I and that's a long story I won't
Yeah.
get into, but the car that he owned at the time was a Stutz Bearcat, which was a really flashy car, a yellow Stutz Bearcat. And his daughter Sydney told me all about that and how he, prided himself in having the only one in Worcester, Massachusetts,
Wow.
and it was quite. And he would race it up. They had hill climbs. They loved hill climbing at the time, and so that was his thing. After he retired, he really wanted to get into motor racing, but it just never
Didn't
happened.
happen. So I'm fascinated by this story because I have heard nothing about this, and it's this powerhouse of an athlete, an American athlete that has been lost to history. You're an accomplished cyclist yourself. How did you find out about Major Taylor and what drew you, what interested you in his story?
Oh, I'm very much interested in knowing more about the history of cycling, and so I dug into it. There were riders who were probably as well known as Major Taylor, but his name kept coming up. And so I guess I adopted him sort of as a boyhood hero,
Yeah.
and I had a stellar career and moved from bicycle racing to triathlon and back again. And I was fortunately chosen to as a nominee, first of all, and then finally was inducted into the US Cycling Hall of Fame in 1989, the same year as Major Taylor. So I reconvened. I had known Sydney Taylor Brown, his daughter. I had met her maybe 5 or 6 years earlier, but I knew then this book had to come about. It was just so powerful in my mind, and I had spent time interviewing Sydney back in Pittsburgh, where she lived, and I got all the stories. She told me so many things that are in the book that really have. I think maybe I might be one of the only people alive that has had that opportunity to interview Sydney. She died at 102. I caught her in the 80s when she was in her 80s
Mhm.
and still quite lucid. And really, as Paul Harvey would say, told me the rest of the story.
Yeah, that's great. And in the book, you describe Taylor's experience with what he called the monster of prejudice. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Well, I can certainly define a few events that occurred as a result of the monster of
Mhm.
prejudice. I want to say one thing before I get into that,
Sure,
though, and remind me if I get off track, because I have
sure.
a bad habit of doing that. Major Taylor never harbored any hostility toward his competitors. I'm sure at the time he may have been a little angry with them, but even though there were incidents where his life was in peril, he never, in his wonderful autobiography, which I have an original copy of, one of the few,
Mhm.
he tells, and you read the stories of what these guys did to him, and he has no hostility at all. He has the perfect Christian turn the other cheek attitude toward his competitors. And after they retired, a number of them came back to him and applauded him, even though they wouldn't let him eat in the same restaurant. They wouldn't allow him to stay in the same hotel. They sort of came back to reality and began treating him with a little bit of respect. But there were incidents. Well, let me tell you about one in Savannah. Savannah was a hotbed of cold weather cycling. They had a beautiful wooden track there, and there was another one in Atlanta. And the South really had a lot of stellar cyclists. And at some point, I think it was about 1894. It was right after his episode in the Sixth Day, which everybody thought would kill off his speed, but didn't. And right after that, he really he got the bit in his mouth and wanted nothing more than to race. And he went down to Savannah. And there's a whole story about that trip, which is pretty exciting, I think. And when he got there, one of the first things he did, that he and his trainer set up the bike. He had two bikes, a road bike and a track bike. And the road bike was set up, and he was just really getting anxious to get out on the road. Went out and started riding, and encountered three riders on a triplet. This was they called them the crack triplet team of the South. And a triplet can generate a lot of speed. And so Major Taylor tried to speak to them, and they kind of blew him off. They had no desire to talk to this black athlete. And, for this is right after, not long after the Civil War. And so he said, well, if you guys are not going to pace me, I'll pace you. And he jumped in front of the triplet and paced them all the way back through the rural areas of Savannah back into town. And they considered that a huge insult.
Mm.
And not long after that, probably the next day after that, a note tied to a rock came sailing through the bay window of the rooming house where Major Taylor was staying with his teammates. He had three teammates there. And the note basically said, and I think there was some mention of who he was. I'm not sure of the actual how it was written, but the gist of it was, leave Savannah by sundown, which was, so it was always by sundown to get out of town. And he did. He left. He didn't wait around. He didn't. But typically, what that means is tar and feathers, which was a horrible way to die in the day. And later, on a track, I'm trying to remember, Taunton, Pennsylvania, dirt track. And they raced on every surface imaginable, including dirt. He had squeezed a rider into the catch fence. And these guys, they were competing for big money, big paychecks. And in order to qualify, you had to three to qualify to get into the final, and there were like 6 heats. And Taylor squeezed this guy against the fence. His name was Becker, and Becker came back. He was like 6'4", 230 pounds, big guy. And he grabbed Major Taylor on the apron of the track by the neck, wrenched him off of his bike, at which point Taylor passed out. And if it hadn't been for the constable with the billy club, we basically beat him until he let go. Major Taylor would all probably have expired right there on the track apron. So that actually happened, and it was one of well, it was probably the closest call he ever had, and it sort of crystallized this: I've got to get out of here. I can't compete in America any longer. This is really, really harmful to my
Yes.
health.
Yeah.
So that's when he signed the contract. And in Europe, he had none of this. There
Interesting.
was no real hostility. There were,
Yeah.
yeah, I suppose the best example of what you today, of course, would be labeled racism was a cartoon, which what they would do, Grand Avant Grand Air, which was a major sporting publication of the day, had a, a photograph of Major Taylor after his early defeat by Jacques Alain. And they exaggerated the shape of his head and the size of his lips to make him look stereotypical. And it was just subtle racism, which the French loved that kind of stuff. And today we would not think highly of anybody who would do that. But that was the photo that appeared after he had lost to
Mm.
Jacqueline. And I don't know where I was going with that, but you get the idea that
Oh,
this is
sure. Well,
this is this is the sort of thing that it's all prevailing. And when he raced in Australia, the same thing. He dominated the competition for almost a year and a half, and then finally the American riders got wind of the fact that he was making a huge amount of money over there, and they were on the next freighter or on the next boat to Australia, and because they were all superstars, they just basically took over and started eroding things and made it very difficult for Taylor. And he had one of the worst crashes of his entire career over there in Australia. Didn't break anything, but just had horrible, horrible abrasions as a
mm,
result of a crash. And it was a world champion to be, Hardy Downing, that took him down. And they disqualified Downing because it was so blatant what he had done. But, he was reinstated because he was good for the gate, just like
mm,
Major Taylor.
yeah. And the damage was done at that point too. So it's,
Oh, yeah.
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 And, you know, it's interesting because he obviously experienced racism, whether it was in the United States or Europe or Australia, but it's pretty telling that he had to leave the United States to have more of a normal competitive life. Did he live in Europe when he was competing there?
Well, not for any length of time. He
Okay.
and his wife Daisy traveled to Europe. She was really interested in seeing Europe and got a good dose of it, I would suppose, over the course of maybe 3 months, which is about the length of the season in Europe, at least the track racing season.
Hmm.
And I think during the time that he down, they visited the cathedrals and really tried to get a better understanding and education while they were there, really wanting to soak up the culture. And ironically, there was his last tour of Europe did not go well, and the reason is he reached a point where I think he had endured so much and had so many awful experiences, not only in the States, but finally in Europe, it got rough. They told him, I think it was probably Victor Briere, who finally came to him and said, "I'm sorry, Major Taylor, this time," which would have been his last tour of Europe, "you have to race on Sunday or you don't race at all." So he reneged on his promise to his mother, and his season was dismal. It didn't ever really get started.
Hmm.
And part of that is his spirit was gone.
Yeah.
But there was one final episode that I tell the story in the book where the French were really dominant in cycling at that period, and the young Frenchman who was probably 10 years younger than Major Taylor at that point, his name, oh boy, well, you'll read it about it in the book, and I'll think of it in a few minutes
Sure.
probably. But he was a cocky young man, and his they knew Major Taylor was on his way back to the States. And so his sponsor, let's see, that would have been Halcyon Bicycles, which
Hmm.
Major Taylor rode for a number of different companies. And his most prominent sponsor was Ivor Johnson, but not on this trip. So Halcyon Cycles had they had these posters that featured scantily dressed women, which of course didn't suit him at all because that just wasn't his Christian upbringing.
Hmm.
But as a favor to Alcyon, he agreed at their request to compete in the final event of the season, which would have been in Rouen, which was Victor Briere, no, not Briere. I promise I'm going to
Or that's
remember it.
okay.
And I'm going to look it up.
Sure.
But the French rider who was dominant at the time met him on his home track in Rouen, and because the race was on Saturday and not Sunday, he finally sort of recovered some of his spirit. And that's really what motivated him more than anything else, more than having a good night's sleep or a good breakfast that morning. What really got him fired up was that spirituality that he had created on his own and believed in very much. And he beat this young man two straight, and it was a three match. So he beat him two. He beat him. He barely lost the second one and won the third one, and again by a strong margin.
Wow.
So here was the best rider in the world. Major Taylor was considered to be the old man at that point. He went from being the young prodigy to the old man, and that was a very long career. But he distinguished himself that day in Rouen, and after that, it was pretty much over. The
Yeah.
season was over. The racing had there were still events in Salt Lake City, the Salt Palace, but his spirit wasn't there anymore because again, the Sunday racing.
What year was, or around what year was the end of his
Well,
career?
end of his career, it's arguably about 1906.
Mm.
And then he had a draft deferment in World War One, which is a really interesting story. And so he never served
Hmm.
in the military, but I think his last race was in 1917 at the Newark Velodrome, which was
Oh.
still in existence at that time. And it featured all of what they referred to as the old timers race. And all of these riders had been his competitors, and he won. And his bike that he didn't even own a bike at that point, hadn't been on a bike in 4 or 5 years. And one of the gentlemen that I met and was also inducted into the Hall of Fame, Alf Goulet, loaned Major Taylor that bike, and I quizzed Alf literally in the closing months of his life.
Hmm.
So I got the great story from from Goulet, how Major Taylor had set the bike up for his body type and adjusted it just right. And it was his favorite machine, and he won easily on it. So, I think those kinds of stories, and I can't tell you how many times there were people that I can't ran into just by chance in some cases back east. A lot of them are in that New York, New Jersey. That Newark had a wonderful velodrome, and the stories that came out of it from some of the old timers were it really crystallized the writing of this book.
Mhm. Can you talk about I want to make sure I get this right, the World Championships in 1899? It sounds like he was essentially robbed of his first attempt and then was victorious. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Well, it was the half mile. A half mile was one of his favorite events, but this happened way too often where it would be a close race. And of course, it was way before they filmed the finishes of these races to actually check the film. So the officials, in many cases, would give the win to somebody else, another rider. And in this case, I don't recall who it was but all of the crowd knew that Taylor had actually won the half mile open, which should have been a world championship. But he just sort of blew it off. He just said, well, if they're going to steal that one, I'm going to make sure it doesn't happen again. And that's how he did things. He would just put his stamp on an event, like suddenly it's the 1 mile. I've got to do the 1 mile now, and that's also my favorite event. I love the 1 mile. And he beat the field. It was actually an American. I'm trying to remember his name, and I'm not doing well with names today. But he beat this other rider who was actually a teammate at one point handily and won the world championship for what should have been the second time. He should
Right.
have had two titles there.
Wow.
So
Wow.
that was really the way it went down, and there were incidents afterwards. He never raced in the UK for some reason, and I finally found out why. The amateur, this was amateur and professional racing at the time, and the amateur champion had issued a challenge to Major Taylor. I said, "I can beat you. I want a shot at you." Taylor just looked at him and called him the Duke of Limbs. That was the name he gave to him. And he didn't race against the kid because it wasn't for money. There was no money involved, and there were strict codes there. The Avery Brundage Olympic concept of amateurism was really strong at the time. So professionals didn't race amateurs. So Major Taylor just never got to the UK, never went to England to race because they never invited him after that.
So, can you talk about you mentioned that he had this love of engineering, and can you talk about what was happening with bicycles at the turn of the century, and did he modify his bikes at all?
Well, there was let me explain it this way. There was a shortage of rubber. Rubber at the time, this is before Goodyear and Firestone invented chemistry of making rubber. And at the time, it was a natural latex rubber. And during the war effort in World War I, all of the rubber was being used for that war effort, and they needed it. So there was a real shortage of rubber. So passenger cars were patching the tubes, and they were horrible. Tires the roads were awful, and because of that, the tires were problematic, and they were good. And I've got some tires in my museum that are made of natural rubber that don't even have cracks, and some of them are 140 years old.
Wow.
So it's just an amazing quality of rubber, natural latex fiber. But Taylor had this brilliant idea because cars of that era had really crude suspensions, leaf springs, and things that today are just considered wagon train primitive. And a lot of them had spoked wheels, wooden spoked wheels, all came from the wagon era. And so on he had a pickup truck that they had originally designed this thing for. And what he came up with, Bertie Munger, his coach, had planted the seed for a suspension system. So what Taylor came up with which I think is a brilliant design, is a radially laced wheel whereby there are springs that I trying to describe this is not easy. From the hub outward toward the outer rim of the wheel, which was separated, and the springs held everything in place. They were really stout springs. And each of these sections had a small piece of natural latex fiber rubber. So it eliminated the need for an inner tube. It was a solid wheel, which created an improved suspension for automobiles of the day. And it was a great idea, and somebody stole it from him. He didn't have a chance to get it patented, and the next thing he knew, it was out there. So for about 10 years, we could have made him a fortune probably if he had been in charge. But instead, it cost him a great deal of money. And his sponsor, Ivor Johnson, had dumped probably $20,000, which was a huge, huge amount of money at the time, into it. And he himself had put about 10 in. So $30,000 loss, that was a huge chunk of his available capital. And he went on. The recapping of the tires was another one. But in all cases, it was too little, too late. Yeah. Bottom line, it was too little, too late. And he owned real estate, 3 or 4 apartment complexes in Worcester, where he had spent most of his life. And that didn't pan out. His Christian brethren, some of them refused to, or didn't, or couldn't pay their rent. So he lost those. And it spiraled downward. And according to his great granddaughter. He did have money at the end, but I certainly didn't see any presence of any wealth. All of his properties had been liquidated, and it's a long story, but I think the end was inevitable. He died in 1932 at the height of the Depression, kind of an
Mm.
Amadeus sort of ending to his life.
Yeah.
Buried in a pauper's grave in Glenmont Memorial Cemetery.
Oh my gosh.
Exhumed 10 years later by Frank Schwinn and put in a very prominent part of the cemetery. But in telling the story, and I had the advantage of speaking at length to Sydney and getting her response, and there'd be times we couldn't continue because she would break up in tears, but she gave me those last few pieces of that proverbial jigsaw of a puzzle because nobody knew.
Yeah.
And I think the way we ended the book, Renee and I talked about this and finally decided there would be a twist ending to it. And the story, I have to tell you, is narrated by one of his boyhood friends, Josh, who is a reporter for the Chicago Tribune, sports reporter, and then later, in a much broader sense, was a reporter of all news.
Hmm.
So that's basically the way the book unfolds.
We'll have to read the book to get the twist
The
ending.
rest of it, yeah.
So one thing that we haven't talked about really is his training and his coaches. Who really, was the team behind him during this?
Well, I'm glad you asked that because there was one coach that worked with Major throughout his career. That was Bertie Munger, who was an industrialist. He had a bicycle factory in Indianapolis, and Taylor worked at the factory until they booted him out of Indianapolis. But he was learned his tool and die trade making there at the Indianapolis factory, and then later took it to Worcester, Massachusetts, where Bertie went with him. They closed the factory in Indianapolis and took the whole community to Worcester, and a lot of the really fine tool craftsmen that built bicycles in the day, they were all just magnificently created on marble tables that had very precise dimensions, and they would braze them together with silver, and they were works of art. And bicycles were like that until about the late 1950s and early 60s.
Wow.
So they've gone from this craftsman guild to carbon fiber in a relatively short period of time.
Yeah. It's been really fun to think about this time frame that you're talking about and trying to place yourself, in this time frame. And it makes his story even more incredible that he was doing this before planes, like you said, being on a steamer ship. And, I wonder what Europe must have been like for he and Daisy as they were exploring in the early 1900s. And that must be a really fun aspect of the book as well, to place yourself in that time period. You mentioned his religious convictions and that he was Christian. Can you talk any more about that? He certainly seemed to have great resilience and, as you said, grace. And was he raised as a Christian, or is that something he found later in life?
He was raised from the very beginning. His parents were devout Christians. And as I said, he believed wholeheartedly that God was with him on his bike at all times and would protect him. And to a large extent, that's kind of the way the career went. Yeah, I think that was fundamental. I really believe that they never lost that. His mother died, not probably he was about 15, 16 years old at the time, and his belief in the Baptist faith was strong. He was considered. I think he even was a deacon at one point after his retirement, and worked with young athletes, tried to instill the values of the Christian faith. And I think that isn't something that's well documented at all. And a large part of it is my speculation. But when you get right down to it, it moved him, and he was a teetotaler most of his all of his career, as far as I know, and just while there's I would like to read one very
Please.
short passage here, which is just a quote from there was a huge dichotomy in his existence where it came down to a single quote from Aeschylus, who is considered the father of Greek tragedy. And Aeschylus said, even in our sleep, pain that we cannot forget falls drop by drop upon the heart until in our own despair, against our will, comes wisdom through the awful grace of God.
Mm,
So it hammered him, it broke him, yet it in many regards, I think, resurrected him and brought him back many times.
yeah.
So there's a lot of back and forth there, and I share that because I think it's important to realize that while Major's career was at its peak, and he was the top moneymaker in all of sport. He made 10 times more money than Ty Cobb, for example, in baseball. In spite of that, he died a pauper. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that if he had just been able to collect a little more cash in his prime, he might have been. But the Sunday racing cost him dearly. It,
Mhm.
it really did. And, you can look at that two ways.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I do. I see the positive, and I certainly see the negative.
Yeah. And was he involved at all with any sort of racial justice or equity and equality in the United States, or no?
Oh, thank you, Megan. That I'm so glad you asked that. In a day when civil rights didn't exist and lynchings were common, clear into the early, part of the 1900s, and so sad that's the way things went after the Civil War. And Major Taylor believed that his allies were people like Booker T. Washington, who founded the Tuskegee Institute for higher learning for African Americans. He was also a good friend of W.E.B. Du Bois. Du Bois, a founder of the NAACP. What else did he? The Crisis magazine, which was, the magazine for Black Americans who wanted to know what was going on in their culture and their lives. I saw one really poignant letter that in the research that I did, and I think I still have it in my archives, where he talks about the importance of getting young Black kids into cycling and sports in general. But after that, that was really the time that he was connected most strongly with Du Bois, and there were other characters that were a bit more worldly, like Jack Johnson. He was a Sydney told me a great story. I got to share this with you, but just to answer your question thoroughly, yes, way before civil rights in the 1960s, it literally took that long. He was a campaigner and believed that it was time to change things. Boys was much more outspoken and at the time considered a radical.
Hmm.
So he embraced that and that evolution. Sydney had a room. Her room was down on the first floor of the Taylor house, and on the second floor, her dad was entertaining Jack Johnson, the heavyweight champion of the world at the time. And they were engaged in a game of billiards. And she said, I remember her telling me this, says, I will never forget till the day I die the sound of those pool cues snapping on that hardwood floor. So I remembered that one, and I think, God, that's got to get in the book.
That's great. That's really great. And, what does Marshall Major Taylor's mean today?
Well, there's a boulevard named after him in Worcester, Massachusetts. That was, of course, his hometown. There's a frieze and a sculpture at the library in Worcester. The Major Taylor Association is located there. My good friend Lynn Tolman is the president of that. And the force of time has cured everybody. And Indianapolis, his hometown, has also adopted him, and they have a velodrome named after him there. So I think the biggest connection are the clubs. There are over 250 clubs with Major Taylor's likeness and his spirit, I should say. So those clubs are worldwide.
Wow.
It's not just in the US anymore. They are many of the places where he was prominent competing. So they have transcended. And
Wow.
while he may have died a pauper, his legacy is certainly living on in a very big way.
That's wonderful. That's really wonderful. And thank you for sharing everything in your brain. And there's so much more in the book. I mean, it's exciting to hear you talk about it, and there's so much more to know and to read. Is there anything that we didn't talk about today that you want to make sure listeners hear or understand?
Well, I think the spirit of forgiveness is important. I think that when he wrote his autobiography and he and his friend Josh, who I will tell you is fictitious in the book, but he tells the story. And there was certainly a character very similar to that. I couldn't use names, but
Mhm.
I think they battle back and forth in the closing years of Major's life. And Josh wanted to tell the story as a journalist. And the autobiography is kind of written in the world of I. Well, that's the way autobiographies go. But Josh wanted to do a different version of it and telling, the rest of the story, as we say, but it didn't happen. And that's part of the twisting ending of the book. But I think just that spirit of forgiveness is so important to not harbor ill will against what these might have been enemies at the time. He chose not to call them enemies. He chose to call them great champions and people who helped plant his spirit too, and were powerful competitors that he eventually overcame. And
That's
they all paid homage to him in that respect.
Yeah, that's really powerful. Very powerful. Well, thank you so much for sharing all of this. And, one of the things that I ask all of my guests is, what have you enjoyed the most about doing this research and writing this book?
Well, traveling to many of the venues where he competed, I had fun in doing that,
Yeah.
certainly, and it's been a lifetime. It's started back in the 80s, and I visited many of those places and actually ridden, well, the only track around at the time back in the 70s, Parc du Princes Velodrome. I believe that was what there were like three tracks in Paris, and I actually competed on one of the tracks where Major Taylor actually raced on. So
Wow.
that was huge back in, I think, about 71 or 72. So that one, and then I got to the cricket grounds in Sydney, and everything was gone. The whole, and so I mined the microfiche labs in Sydney, and totally enjoyed that experience because I could see the actual microfiche version of those stories, and just reeling through there was just like he was there with me
Mm,
because everything was documented.
yeah.
So a tremendous amount of information there in especially in the microfiche labs in the what I call the rum library, because rum built it.
That's great. And another question that I ask all of my guests is, what advice would you give to your younger self? And you can answer this however you would like. You're certainly an accomplished and decorated athlete yourself, but it could be, however you want to answer that.
They're minor, Megan.
Oh, that's good.
I think mostly financial
Yeah.
bad decision making, of course, would hit the list.
Yeah.
But what would I tell my younger self? Well, yeah, to embrace the sport even more than I did,
Mm,
perhaps, and it probably would have ended my career sooner. But I had the opportunity to become the first American to ride the Tour de France, which of course is the gold standard of bicycle racing. And I turned that down, and I would have ridden for the top team of the era, the TI Raleigh team that included all the Dutch champions who were dominant in that era. But I just didn't, I didn't want to learn. I didn't want to learn their language so much, and a lot of them did speak English, but it just didn't appeal to me. And
mhm,
and and I think that's part of that era. Today it would be with a team, an actual team, and yeah, it would have been an exclusive existence that I would have had to endure, and I just said no to it. And
Sure.
and went back to school and probably never looked back. But yeah, I would have made the decision to do it at the time.
Sure. Sure. And, what does Marsha Major Taylor mean to you personally?
Oh, he was the ultimate inspiration for a career that I launched on the basis of his acclaim, and we were just the opposite in terms of our ability. I was not a sprinter. He was a sprinter. I was more of a road rider, and he distinguished himself on both fronts.
Mhm,
So I always admired him from the perspective of something I could never do, and that
mm,
was I won a fair number of sprints, but to win consistently, no, never happened. So mostly it was, gosh, what I would have given to have that fast twitch white muscle fiber.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Amazing. That's great. And how can people find you, find your museum, find your book?
Uh, well, the best way, of course, is to yeah, Barnes and Noble should have it. I can't guarantee they're going to have it in their stores, but it is in the catalog. They can't order it. Amazon, we don't make any real money on
Mhm.
Amazon book sales, but that's a quick. If you want the book quickly, that's the way to get it. If you would like to take a little longer, slower tour, majortaylorstory.com is our website. And I encourage people to do that. They'll see the wonderful Ona Mills paintings, the Major Taylor, and all of them. I think we've got all of her work displayed. I commissioned her to paint those, and she did a young Major Taylor and 10 years later into his career, and you can certainly see the difference in terms of appearance.
Sure.
So yeah, that would be, and there's more information that's not in the book on the website. So
Okay.
majortaylorstory.com. The book itself is available in hardcover, softcover, ebook, and Audible.
Oh,
So those
there's
are the
no
formats.
excuse. There's no
Yeah.
excuse. You got everybody covered. That's amazing.
Yes,
Well,
yes.
and this is definitely a book that I want to read with my kids as well because there's a lot to learn and there's a lot to discover and it seems really exciting as well. So this is great. Thank you for spending so much time with us today.
Thank you, Megan. You've been a wonderful host.
Wonderful. Thanks. Thanks for listening to Wait, What Do You Do Again? For more information about today's guest, or if you'd like to be on the show, please visit megdeford.com. See you next time.